Aloha, it's Joe Parnavilla with another Forbes Books podcast, and there's been a mass exodus of workers that's been called the Great Resignation. According to SHRM, the Society of Human Resource Management, over 40% of U.S. workers are actively searching for a new job right now or plan to soon. That's twice the rate in 2019. Obviously, the pandemic plays a huge part in the turnover tsunami, but it's not the only reason. In that same SHRM study, 56% of people considering finding new jobs are doing so because of their managers. Because when it all comes down to it, culture matters. This week, I have the pleasure of catching up with my old friend, David J. Friedman. He's the best-selling author of Culture by Design, and he's here to talk about why great cultures don't just happen on their own. David, welcome to the podcast. How you doing?
Fantastic. Great to talk with you, Joe.
It's always great talking to you, Dave. And one of the things we've spoken a few times, and I keep forgetting to ask you this, but why culture? You seem like a really, really smart guy. Why has culture been the thing that you've zeroed into in your life?
It was sort of accidental, to be honest with you, Joe. So quick story that give you the background to this. So I spent 27 years as the CEO of an employee benefits consulting company in the Philadelphia area. And it was a very successful company, but I would tell you that virtually all of the success that we had, I mean, literally all of it, was based upon the culture that we had built in that company. And I'll tell you how it came about that. But the short version is that it was the foundation of all of our success. And so after I eventually sold that company and ended up writing a book about the things we had done to make that so successful, that led to people asking me to speak about it. And next thing I knew, I was becoming a culture guy. That's sort of how it happened. But honestly, when I think back to my early beginnings of how did I in that company come up with this whole culture thing, honestly, it wasn't culture to me. It was about standards, that I have very high standards for the way that I like to work and the way that I want my company to be. And I knew very early in my first company that if I wanted all of my staff to play at the level that I play and to work at the standards that I had, well, I couldn't just assume they were going to somehow magically figure that out. I figured I needed to articulate what was important to us and how I wanted us to be. And I needed to teach that stuff to people so that would be the way we did things in our company. It was only later upon reflection that I realized, I guess that's kind of what culture is. It's a way of doing things. So I wasn't in the early days, I wasn't thinking we have to build a culture here and here's how I'm going to go about doing it. I was thinking about, I want us to perform in extraordinary ways and I got to teach our people how we want to do that. And I guess that was culture, and that became our culture.
That's awesome. And it's funny, too, because as a Gen Xer, and without sounding too glib, the word culture and sort of this culture phenomenon in business books, it's a very millennial thing. Like, I can't even remember the phrase culture being used in the 90s. I mean, David, correct me if I'm wrong, when you were building this amazing company for 20-something years, can you remember when the word culture came around? Because I'm sure it wasn't that word wasn't thrown around much.
It wasn't in the 90s. I would say later, I'd say after 2000, it became more of a thing that people would talk about why they came to work for us because of the culture and that they stayed with us because of the culture. Customers probably didn't talk about it as much, but it's interesting, when you talk about that change. So I do, as I think you know, I do lots and lots of talks for CEO groups. And I've noticed a real significant change in the last, I'm going to say, 5 years in particular. And the change is that in the first, when I started doing these talks for CEO groups about culture and why it's so important and how to do it, when I started doing those talks, what would happen is I would start the talk talking about, explaining to these CEOs why culture was such a big thing. And what I've noticed is that in the last 5, 6, 7 years, culture has become so hot as a big topic that now when I start the talk, what I often will do is I'll say, all right, we're all in this room. I got 15 or 20 CEOs. And I'll say, look, let's all be honest with each other. Let's cut through the BS. This culture stuff, is this really just a bunch of fluff? Or does this really matter? Like, why should we even bother talking about it? And I just shut up and I let them tell me why it's so important. And you should see how animated they get. I'll have these CEOs saying, are you kidding me? It's the single most important thing in my company. This is our biggest thing that makes us successful. And I'll ask, well, tell me more about that. Well, why is that? And I just let them go on, and they tell me they just get really passionate about how important culture is to them. And that wasn't true they weren't thinking about it in that way 5 or 10 years ago. But there's been so much attention paid to it that it's a really hot topic for people.
That's brilliant. And, it's funny. I always find that the best CEOs are the ones that are willing to adapt. It's the old Moneyball adapt or die thing. A friend of mine helps hoteliers build hotels and come up with new concepts. And he said, because of the way social media has impacted the hospitality industry, whenever he goes into a meeting with a multimillionaire or even a billionaire hotel builder, the very, very first question this billionaire asks, and it's usually a 50 or 60 plus year old man, first question, always, where is our Instagrammable moment? Where will people want to take a picture in our hotel? And I say to the guy, I'm like, that's brilliant that this older guy who we all like, I always joke that ageism is the last ism that's allowed to be joked about, but we all like to joke that old guys don't get it and they don't change with the times. But when you see these incredibly successful businessmen not even worry about, like, what's the aesthetic of the hotel going to be like? What's the feel? What's the clientele? It's like, where are people going to be able to post Instagram photos from? And is that what you find as well? Like these, and you kind of mentioned a couple there, like these CEOs that are so passionate about culture that you don't even have to explain it anymore. Those are the ones that really, really make it and succeed.
Yeah, I think that's true, Joe, that the best leaders get it. And I think what's changed really is just the language we use around it. I mean, these things have always been important. It's always been important to have people who feel engaged, who feel connected to what we're trying to do, who want to be in a place where we work with high standards and do fantastic work. I think that's always been true. We just didn't have language for it before. Now we just call that culture. Before we still thought about that stuff.
Right.
Now we're calling that stuff culture. And really, when I think about the work that I do and the speaking that I do, most of the time, what I'm really doing is I'm demystifying this whole topic. That the word culture, it just over time, in many cases, it became associated with this fluffiness, with this idea that, oh, we let everybody bring their dog to work, and we have pizza every Friday, and oh, isn't that a great culture? And I guess you read the articles or you see videos about places like Google and other places, and oh man, what a great place that is! Everybody's got free to, they got childcare there, and they play foosball all day and all kinds of other stupid things, and people tend to think when they hear the word culture, sometimes they're thinking about that kind of stuff. And I like to help them, especially these 50 and 60-year-old leaders, understand that forget all that stuff. That's not what we're talking about. We're talking about how do you create an environment that causes your people to perform at the highest level? Because this is about performance. It's not about bringing your dog to work. It's about getting people to perform at the highest level. And you create the right environment to do that, and it's going to take place. And one of the examples I often use that seems to resonate with people about this is early in many of my talks, I talk about public high school sports dynasties. So in particular, I usually use the example of the high school that I went to and the town I still live in. And there's a women's lacrosse team there that has, for years and years and years, every year they're ranked in the top 5 or 10 in the country. And I talk about how public high school sports dynasties are really interesting to me because they have two dynamics that make them kind of unusual. The first dynamic is that in a public high school, you can't recruit. You're just stuck with whoever happens to show up in your town.
Right.
And I say that, so think about that in the context of your company. Imagine if anybody who knocked on your door and said, I'd like to work for you, you had no choice but to take them onto your company. I mean, how hard would that be to build a great company? Yeah, that's what public high schools do. Secondly, in a school environment, you're turning over your roster every year. I mean, kids are graduating. Yeah. And so think about that again in the context of your company. Imagine if anybody who knocked on the door and said, I'd like you to hire me, you had to take them, and you turned over most of your roster every year or two. How hard would that be to build a great company? And yet, that's what public high school sports dynasties do. And so if you think about, well, what's going on there? Like, how is that happening? They have built cultures. They've built levels of expectation. And everybody's had this experience. If you've ever been on a high-level program, whether it was a sports team, a dance troupe, a band, an orchestra, whatever it was, there was a level of expectation there that you joined that team and you knew that, man, we do things in a certain way. We play like champions here. And it causes everybody to elevate their game in a way that they wouldn't on a different team. Same person, they're going to perform differently. And I just help people to see, because we've all had those experiences, that the environment that you create, the expectations that you create in that environment have a profound impact on how people show up to do what they do. So I haven't talked about culture really. I'm just talking about creating an environment that causes people to want to perform at a higher level. And I say that, okay, if we understand that, then as leaders, as CEOs of our companies, if we had a way that we could purposely create the kind of environment that would cause people to perform at their best, well, that would seem like a pretty obvious thing to do. And yet most organizations don't. They just kind of live with whatever happens instead of purposely creating it. So when we see culture from that kind of way and not as bring your dog to work, it starts to resonate with that 55 or 65-year-old CEO.
That's brilliant. And I'm curious because as you're sharing that anecdote, I'm sure some of these leaders may even have sort of this old chicken or the egg thing. So obviously there's high schools and teams that have built this amazing culture over time, but you need that one. You need that spark. So whenever you share that anecdote, does anyone say, well, how did they start that culture? Like it didn't just one day become this monolith of just excellence. Is when people ask you that, like, well, so how did they get that way? What steps did they take to do that?
It's really always a leader, if it's a sports team, it's a coach, who says, this is how we're going to do things here. There's a specific way that we're going to create an environment of excellence. And they set the standard, which is what I teach companies to do. I think about if I go to that lacrosse team in my high school, I've seen them, they'll win a game, 20-2, and then they're on the field after the game's over working on things because the coach was disappointed in how they played. Because they're not playing the other I've heard Nick Saban talk about this from Alabama, that they're not playing the other team. They're playing against their own standard of excellence. And when you have a leader or a coach who sees it that way, that we're playing against our own standard of excellence, and so we're not satisfied unless we're being great, that's the kind of environment you create. And it starts with a leader, a coach, somebody who says, this is the way we're going to do it. I had the good fortune, I think I mentioned to you, of spending some time in the last few days with Horst Schulze. Horst Schulze was the founder of Ritz-Carlton and the creator of their culture. And he's really an extraordinary guy. He's 82 years old now, but he's done just some amazing things in creating the standards of excellence. And he said something interesting to me. He said that in his view, the primary roles of a CEO, he said there's two roles that are really important. He said one is the CEO is responsible for the vision of the company. Where are we going? What are we trying to be? And the same is true on a sports team or any other organization. He said the second thing, though, that I thought was fascinating is he said that the CEO is responsible for the standards of the organization. And think about that, and the coach as well. What are the standards we play to here? Are we mediocre? Are we fantastic? And how do we get to be fantastic? What are the standards that I'm setting here and establishing that this is the way we do things around here? And great organizations, I go back to, I mentioned Nick Saban in Alabama is legendary, that, they talk about their process and the way they do things. And you'll watch Nick Saban, you watch an Alabama game on TV, and they'll be in the fourth quarter and they're winning 62-0, and they've got the third and fourth string guys in, and somebody jumps off sides, and you'll see Nick, Saban go ballistic. Now, this is the third or fourth string, and the game's over, and it doesn't matter, but it does matter because we play to a certain standard here, and you don't relax those standards, and that's what great leaders do.
That's great. And, I wonder, as we joked about the olden times when you were CEO, David, that the leadership abilities and the culture that was being built was almost unintentional, like it was just sort of, it came from this person or yourself. And I feel like you can't leave it to unintentionality anymore. It has to be very intentional these days, right? When it comes to building culture, like what is it that a lot of companies have? Like they have like a motto board or something like that, where they have like all their key steps of what makes the team and everything like that. There is a part of that today, right? Where you sort of have to be intentional as to what kind of culture you're building.
Well, I think you've always had to be. It's just people often weren't. But you're absolutely right, Joe. And the way that there's a sort of a dynamic that takes place that I often describe, particularly for growing CEOs. And the dynamic that takes place is that, or growing companies, is that when a company is small, much as you described, when a company is small and it just started out and the entrepreneur built the company and he's got 5 or 10 or 15 or 20 people, he or she didn't have to talk about culture so much. They just set the example. And, you set a good example and people see you every day and they figure, just be like Joe. If I'm be like Joe, then it'll work out okay. And that was good enough. But as a company grows, and this isn't a function of like old times versus new times, it's a function of growth. When a company grows and they go from 10 or 15 or 20 to 50 or 100 or 200, or they have multiple locations, or they make an acquisition or two, all of a sudden, there aren't a lot of people who are seeing the CEO anymore. I mean, your example isn't going to be enough because the organization's too big. And so most of the people aren't going to have many interactions with you as the CEO. So if the only way people were picking up the culture was by somehow observing you, you're going to be up a creek when the company gets a lot bigger. And that's why it becomes so important as a company grows to not leave that to the chance that people happen to observe and pick up your example, but rather we have to have a systematic, intentional method to create the culture that we want. There's a quote that is in my last book, and it's my favorite quote on the topic of culture. And the quote, and I think it really captures what you're asking, the quote says that good companies have good cultures by chance, but world-class companies have world-class cultures by design. And what I mean when I say that to people is that when I say that good companies have good cultures by chance, what I notice is that if you're a good leader, so if anyone listening to this podcast, if you're a good leader, you're naturally going to do most of the right stuff. This isn't rocket science. You're going to hire good people who are kind of like you. Even if you're not thinking about it, it happens almost on its own. You're like a magnet and they glom onto you. Mm-hmm. And you're going to treat those people reasonably well, not because you read some book that said you should treat your people that well. Like, what the hell else are you going to do? You're a good person. And so, of course, you're going to do that. And if you do that, you will have a pretty decent culture. This isn't that hard. But I say that and my observation is that the best companies, the really world-class companies, understand just how impactful and how important their culture is. And they don't leave any of that to chance. It's just simply too important to leave to chance. Instead, they're incredibly purposeful and systematic and intentional, to use your word, about how they go about building and creating and embedding the culture they want into every part of the organization. It's simply too important to leave to chance. And I think that's really the difference.
And going back on something you mentioned there, do you feel a lot of CEOs that when it comes to maybe it's a company with more than 50 or 100 people, have a sort of Pollyannish view of what their company culture is because of the thing you mentioned? The CEO isn't going to have face-to-face with all 100 people. And so to them, they have maybe meets with like 4 or 5 different people. And to that CEO, oh man, this company culture must be great because these 5 people I speak to are just amazing, high-performing individuals. But he doesn't know what's going on with the other 95 people. So how does a CEO get a real sense of the company culture when it's that big, when they don't have all those touch points that a CEO of a smaller company would have?
Yeah, it's a good question. And so first of all, I don't think, I mean, certainly there are some CEOs who may have a Pollyanna kind of view of it. And I don't think it's as exaggerated, it's quite as exaggerated as that, but certainly they have a distorted view that, they only get certain information because, to your point, that they have a circle of influence of people that they see or talk to that's fairly limited and isn't representative of the overall organization. So other data points one can get, certainly talking to the managers and leadership team and those who have more interactions with more people, you can look at data points like things like Glassdoor. With the internet, anything that people think is good or bad, they post. So you could look at Glassdoor comments and see, well, what are people saying there? A lot of people saying this place stinks. or people saying, no, this is a really good place. So you could look at things like that. Another thing, something that we do in our own company. So our company's culture is defined in terms of a very specific set of behaviors that we teach that are called our fundamentals, because they're fundamental to success. So when I talked about Horst Schulze and standards, those are our standards. That's how we operate. And we do an annual survey. And what we do on the survey is we take each of the behaviors that define our culture, these fundamentals, as I call them, and we write a description of what would you see as you're interacting with us? What would you notice in us if we were doing this well? So let me give you an example. One of our fundamentals is called honor commitments. It's just really important to me. And so the description would say, our employees do what they say they're going to do when they say they're going to do it. That's what we mean by honoring commitments. So we write a description like that for each of our fundamentals, our behaviors that define our culture. And then every year we actually do a survey, which as you and I are doing this podcast right now, we're just completing our survey for this year. And every year we survey all of our customers, we survey our vendors and suppliers, and we survey our own employees. And we ask them on each one of these individual behaviors, as you interact with us, what do you notice? Do we almost always, usually, sometimes, seldom, or never do this? So now we're being pretty transparent about this and getting real feedback. Then we take the almost always, usually, sometimes, seldom, or never, and we convert that to a 5, 4, 3, 2, 1 scale. And now we can actually put a number on how well we're doing in living to our culture, not in my fantasized vision, but based on the feedback of real people who interact with our people all the time. And if we're into continuous improvement, as my company certainly is, we could look at what our score is this year, and we could resurvey next year and ask, have we improved the degree of consistency between what we claim our culture is, or what I thought our culture was, and what really shows up every day? So that's a great way to get some real feedback about it.
I love that. And I want to pick up on something you said, distorted view. And I guess I want to tie that into the pandemic. A lot of leaders had sort of this distorted view that their teams were more collaborative than they actually were, because they were sitting in an office. Like they just assumed, everyone is sitting within 5 feet of each other, everyone must be collaborating. Where, David, you probably know as well as I do, a lot of these companies, as it may appear that there's this great culture where people love working at it, the term silo gets thrown around, where everyone's sort of like in their own silo, doing their own job. The company culture may be great, where everyone gets along and everyone's happy to be there, but there's not this way of collaboration. So, and the way I want to tie this into the pandemic is, a lot of leaders feel like, oh my God, now everyone's going to be at their own home, just sitting at their computer all by themselves. How is that going to affect company culture? So how has that affected company culture, or has it in terms of performance when it comes to teams?
Well, I think it's a similar issue, Joe, to what I was describing when I talked about companies growing in that dynamic that I was describing. So think about when companies, I talked about how when a company is growing and they go from being a small company to a larger company, and that dynamic that I described, that we can't rely on physical proximity to be the primary driver of culture because we have too many people. Well, what happened with the pandemic is it forced that exact same dynamic on virtually everybody. Right. Because whether your company's small, medium, or large, your people aren't together anymore. And so again, if the only way people were figuring out what the culture was and absorbing it was by physical proximity, by being together and seeing each other, well, when people are at home and we're not seeing each other, well, how are we going to get the culture now? And so I think the main thing that forced is we have to become more systematic about it, and we have to plan more. So, we have to schedule time to do a Zoom call to get together to talk about things that might need to get talked about, whether it's just what's happening in our department or what's happening with this particular customer. Because before, I could walk by somebody's desk, and while they saw me, they might have said, "Hey, David, by the way, I just want to mention that I talked to the ABC company the other day, and this is what's going on there." Oh, great! That happened just because we saw each other, or we're in the kitchen and we're talking about yesterday's football game, and that conversation morphs into a discussion about a client. Well, that's not happening unless we schedule it. So we actually have to schedule time and be more thoughtful about saying, okay, let's put a meeting on the calendar and do this and do it by Zoom. Now, what's interesting, though, is we tend to think of all that as negative. And yet, I would say there's a whole lot of positive things that have happened. So I think we've found that we have the ability to bring more people into a meeting more easily than we might have before. So think about if we've got multiple locations, it was hard before for people who work in different locations of our company to physically get together and have a meeting. So we'd have a meeting with just you and me, but somebody who's working in another office doesn't participate. Well, now we've gotten so used to, oh yeah, I'll just bring in people from all over the country and the customer and somebody else, and we'll just jump on Zoom, we'll do a meeting, or we'll jump on Teams and we'll do a meeting. So I think to some extent there's greater collaboration because we found that we can connect people more quickly and easily by doing a video call.
But to call back something we discussed earlier, it's being intentional. It's you can't assume this
all
happens.
About that.
Someone's
Yes.
got to take the reins and be like, okay, we're doing this meeting tomorrow, 2:00. Here we go. Meet the Zoom link. Here, this is how we're going to get these things done. Someone has to take the reins of that.
That's absolutely true. And I think, one of the things that I say all the time is when I look at the difference, I'm going to broaden that thought. When I look at the difference between pretty good people and amazing people and pretty good companies and amazing companies, if I were to boil the essence of what separates them into one word, it's the word intentionality. That good athletes are really talented and they do pretty well just because they're so talented. But world-class athletes are intentional about their training, about their sleep, about what they eat, about their rest and their recovery, just everything that they do. Good companies, as I said in my quote earlier, they have good cultures by chance. They do a lot of good things. They got smart people. They hired some really good people. If you hire good people, they're going to do good work. They're not going to stink. You'll have a lot of good stuff going on. But world-class companies understand that we got to be intentional about this stuff. We're not going to just leave it to the whims of, did I happen to hire somebody good? I had an interesting experience the other day. I was flying, I was doing a talk in Cleveland. When you fly to Cleveland, if you go to Cleveland Airport, this is true in many airports, the rental car facility is offsite and you take a bus from the airport to the rental car facility. Oh,
it's such a blast. I look forward to that during every trip doing that.
But sometimes, so I was going from the airport to the rental car facility, and the bus driver, this guy was really enthusiastic and he was friendly and he welcomed everybody and he, said this is going to be great and he helped everybody with their bags. And he was really different. And often that bus driver is like a grunt who, barely looks at people and
just getting through the day.
Getting through the day. But what was important about this, my observation of this guy, my reflection about that at least, is I thought to myself, is the fact that this guy was extraordinary was most likely luck. In other words, the company that was running, whoever runs that concession, was probably not doing a training program that says, these are the standards by which we're going to operate our bus. Yeah. When people come in, you say this, you look at them in the eye, you greet them, you make sure it's a great day for them. They didn't do that. This was just lucky that this guy happened to be a rock star. And this guy has a rock star attitude. And whether he was sweeping the floors, cleaning the toilets, driving the bus, or he was a salesperson, he's going to be a rock star because that's who he is. But the question is, in your company, is it just the luck of the draw that I happen to talk to somebody who's great because they just happen to be? Or is that the way your company runs? Because this is the way we do things here. In the best companies, there's a way that we do things here, and it's all intentional.
I love that. One more thing on the pandemic. I think the one thing that this virtual office has sort of done, it's pulled the curtain on personalities. And I've had CEOs tell me, it was like, I've been in so many meetings with, video chats on Zoom or Google Meets where I just see dead eyes and people who are just, they look like they're emotionally been sucked dry of any kind of feeling. And it's funny. You talk about that rock star bus driver. Not everyone is going to be Robin Williams on a talk show or Martin Short being Martin Short. Everyone's personalities are different. And that's one of the things with the pandemic and all these Zoom meetings showed is that not everyone is going to be big smile and very enthusiastic about doing a Zoom call, whereas in public, you have more of this sort of personal dynamic where you have body language and stuff, and you can't see that so much. So that's one of the things I always found funny about the pandemic is like, everyone's like, oh man, everyone's just so miserable. And it's like, no, it's heightened because you're seeing their face blown up on your screen. You don't see what their body language is. You don't see what's going on. So when it comes to that, David, maybe when it's in terms of you running your teams or with CEOs, some of them feel like every member has to be a rah-rah person, but not everyone's going to be like that or appear like that in a virtual meeting.
Yeah, I don't think, to me, it's not so much about being a rah-rah person. It's about, to me, more than anything, and this is just what drives me, is it's about excellence. It's about having an attitude of excellence that says, whatever my role is, whether it's I'm a bookkeeper, I don't have to be a rah-rah person, but I'm going to be the best damn bookkeeper you've ever seen in your life, because that's the way I do things. I play to a high standard. And whether I'm the bookkeeper, the receptionist, the salesperson, a bus driver, cleaning toilets, it's creating an environment that causes people, and again, it doesn't have to be rah-rah, but it causes people to be inspired to want to be the best version of themselves in whatever their role is. And that's what you want to create as a leader, is an environment that causes people to want to do that. I had an email this morning from my executive assistant who is reasonably new in working with me. She's been with me for about 3 or 4 months. And the short version of the story is she made a mistake in something that she did, and she felt really bad about it. And she wanted to tell me that she felt bad about it. I didn't want to put a lot of pressure on her, but she felt really bad about a mistake that she made, and she's going to work harder at this. But I'm literally looking at this email right now. The last 2 sentences of her email is she said, "I can't tell you how much I've learned from you already. You make me want to do business better."
Wow.
And that's what we want to be as leaders, is I want her to want to do business better, not because I'm a jerk and I'm demanding, but because hopefully I'm inspiring her to want to be the best that she can be. And I think if we create the right environments, we can do that.
His name is David J. Friedman. He is the best-selling author of Culture by Design, a must-read for any leader of any kind of business. David, thank you so much for the time. I always enjoy our chats, and I wish you the best of luck and can't wait to see what you do next in the culture space.
My pleasure, Joe. Thanks for being with me.
You're very welcome, David, and that's it for this edition of the Forbes Books Podcast. If you enjoy the show, make sure you take a second to subscribe so you automatically get the new shows when they drop. Also, if you have a minute, I would love if you left us a review so more amazing entrepreneurs like yourself can discover the show. And please don't forget the golden rule and treat others as you want to be treated. Thanks for listening. Until next time, adios.
This has been a production of Forbes Books Radio. Find out more at ForbesBooksRadio.com.